One of the things mentioned by Dr. Ravenhill yesterday, I believe it was, that was so interesting to me, and then Dell affirmed it, is that one of the ways to create thirst and hunger, desire for revival in the hearts of young revivalists or young pastors who desire revival is to give illustrations, examples out of history. The Bible tells us don't remove those ancient landmarks, which I think represent the ways of God as He has moved in our lives or in our churches or in a nation in history past. And so today we thought it would be valuable for us to be exposed to a particular movement of God as represented here by two individuals who just happened to be there. And that's exactly many times how it is. When God sends revival, we just happen to be there because He's the one that is doing the work, and we're there to kind of direct the traffic. But here on my left is Bill McLeod, who is a pastor of the church where really God began to descend upon that resulted in then the outflow from that began the revival in Canada in the early 70s, actually Western Canada, and then spread from there. And then Ralph Sutera of the Sutera twins, who were the tools, the instruments that God brought to that community to begin teaching revival principles that God then honored and blessed, and then again was birthed the revival in Western Canada. So we thought we'd ask them today to relate some of the story of what took place in the revival in Western Canada. And I thought it might be good to maybe, Bill, maybe you could begin a little bit, what preceded it there in your church? I've heard you share before some things with us that really were interesting, and I think a key ingredient to any revival. And then maybe the two of you could share from there, how did it begin to develop, what were some of the results, and just some of the things that are special to your heart, maybe some illustrations of changed lives or whatever in relation to the revival in Western Canada.
I moved to Saskatoon from Winnipeg in 1969, and I was very happy to become pastor of this church because in the conference of churches I was associated with, it was one of the better churches. A lot of our people were Bible school graduates, and I was excited about the possibility of getting the church on the road for God. And so this was how I came. I knew it was the will of God I go. That was made very clear to me. I had no doubts about that. However, I could not get the church on the road. I tried every scheme I could. I talked with other pastors. I read books. I tried this. I tried that. And nothing changed. We had good evangelistic teams come, singers, preachers, and they'd have a week of meetings, pack the pew program, all of these sort of things. But a week after they were gone, you'd never know they'd been there. There may have been one or two backsliders restored, a couple of people converted, some people started tithing, a few people wanted to join the church. But the church was basically identically the same after these special efforts as before. So I came to the conclusion, I will not go this way anymore. I'm going to start praying for revival. I'd read a lot about revival. I had never seen it. I longed to see it. I began praying for God to revive the church. I didn't understand that God, first of all, had to revive me. I had some deacons I thought needed revival. I thought my wife needed revival. There were some long-tongued ladies in the church that certainly needed revival. And God kept telling me that I needed it. Matter of fact, God made it very clear that I was the number one hindrance to revival in the church. Unto you I say, and unto the rest in Thyatira. So God was speaking to me first of all. After getting this burden to pray for revival, I got the church involved. And I think this is extremely important. I don't think we can do it on our own. Pastors often complain to me, well, I've only got a couple of people that believe in revival that'll pray. Okay, so you've got two, pray with them. Get it started. Moody preached in a church, Theodore Kyler's church. He preached for 3 solid weeks, and the biggest crowd they had on a weeknight was 30. And Kyler said to Moody, Moody, this is very slow work. And Moody said, listen, he said, you can't have a big fire until you have a small one. And at the end of 3 weeks, a small fire started, which became a conflagration which touched the whole city eventually. Well, I had a few people that wanted to pray. We began emphasizing the prayer meeting. I used to tell people, don't miss prayer meeting, whatever happens. Miss Sunday morning if you have to, miss Sunday evening if you must. Don't ever, ever miss the prayer meeting. And people caught on to that, and the prayer meeting started to grow. We began children's prayer meeting in connection with our prayer meeting. Finally, we'd have maybe 35 or 40 kids there, and 2 separate children's prayer meetings, monitored by an adult, but run by the children themselves in conjunction with the main prayer meeting on a Wednesday night. We cut off all other activities on Wednesday night. No choir practice, no business meetings of any kind, no committee meetings. This is prayer meeting. And we emphasize prayer. And I stopped all this 40-minute preaching stuff and got down to maybe 15 or 20 minutes sharing promises from the Bible and giving incidents of answered prayer from history and so on, recent history and history far back. And this encouraged the people. Then I encouraged them to share answers to prayer and personal needs. Not for Uncle Joe somewhere else. If you have a personal need, share at the meeting. We'll pray for you. And we did. So the prayer meeting grew from 25 to 35 to 55 to 75 to 105. And it seemed every Wednesday night at a certain period, probably, let's say 6 months before Ralph and Lou came, every Wednesday night there were more people in the prayer meeting. The center section filled up. The 2 side wings began to fill up. The church would seat about 300 full. We had about 175 members, and sometimes we had 175 people in the prayer meeting. Then in conjunction with that, I started a deacon's prayer meeting on a Saturday night, 9 o'clock Saturday night. We had 10 deacons, an average of 7 deacons attended. Sometimes all 10 were there, specifically to pray for revival. By the way, that I started 5 years. That was the first thing we did, I guess, as far as revival is concerned. Then we had a round-the-clock prayer meeting. People would take a 15-minute slot. Pretty soon we had the whole 24 hours taken up, which means that any time of the day or night, someone from our church was on their knees praying. Now, in relation to the meetings to Ralph and Lou coming, we did practically no advertising at all. Matter of fact, I used to think if they find out how little advertising we've done, they maybe won't even come. But I was so discouraged with going that route. And I'd heard that the boys had a different style ministry, and I was very, very anxious to have them come. So we had cottage prayer meetings, ladies' prayer meetings, men's prayer meetings. We told people when you're praying over your food, pray for revival. Any time of the day God moves you to pray for revival, pray for revival. And finally, there's a great spirit of prayer for revival in the church. Then people began telling me that God was waking them through the night to pray. So we began to urge this from the pulpit. Ask God to waken you through the night to pray. I was finding the same thing. And as I've said many times before, when we got serious about prayer, God got serious about it too and began to give us a spirit of prayer. So that now people could pray for a whole hour at night. It was no problem at all. Before they'd say, I can't pray for 5 minutes. What do you say after 5 minutes? People actually said that to me. What do you say after 5 minutes? Now an hour sometimes was not long enough. And so we prepared principally by prayer, but in my own heart, just before I asked Ralph to come in here, and the truth of Galatians 2:20 had plagued me for years. I just couldn't get a handle on it. I read everything I could read on, including Maxwell's book, Born Crucified, and it helped me, but somehow I couldn't get a hold of it. How can I get crucified with Christ? And finally I decided it just must be some kind of a beautiful doctrine that doesn't have much practical meaning. But I knew that couldn't be true either. About maybe 5 or 6 months before the revival meetings in the fall of 1971, I got a handle on Galatians 2:20, actually through Romans chapter 6, where the Lord said, reckon you also yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin. He didn't say if you feel that way. He didn't say if you have some evidence this is true. He simply said, reckon yourself to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto God through Jesus Christ our Lord. And a fire was born in my heart. Now, Ralph and Lou sharpened this up a great deal when they came. I'd never heard this kind of preaching before. About 5 weeks before the revival, I was praying one night, and God filled me with the Spirit in a very, very definite way. I didn't speak in tongues or have any experience of that kind, but I couldn't doubt what God had done in my heart. I think I'll turn it over to Ralph now.
before I get started, get back to something about the futility of all the things you were doing in the church. And what were you doing during that time where you got tired of everything else that wasn't working?
Well, I kept preaching the Word of God. I've always preached a lot of Bible, and I kept doing that. And I remember one day one of the ladies said, "I wish you quit scolding us all the time." Now, I didn't realize I was scolding people. I didn't think I was scolding people, but it brought another element to my preaching, and that was love. I think I was scolding the people. So you don't just back off from doing everything and sit down and wait for something to happen. We had missionary conferences, and we did a lot of things. Matter of fact, we did a lot of door-to-door calling, evangelism, and so on. We got the reputation in Saskatoon of being the main church insofar as door-to-door evangelism was concerned. And one of the problems was this, though. I remember there's a period of time when, for I forget how long now, but a number of souls, a couple of souls, 2 or 3 be saved every week. And you know, we baptized hardly any of those people, and any of those that kept walking with God went to other churches. And it really bugged me. Then some of my best people began going to other churches, and that bugged me more. Because as a preacher, you have to explain this to your people. So it went like this. Oh, yes, they went over to the Alliance Church, but you know, they're church hoppers. They won't stay there long either. And God really convicted me about this lying I was doing. See? And God made me realize, listen, this is my church. I had my big hands on that church to such an extent, God couldn't work. And I had to take my hands off, and I remember telling God, you can take every member of my church and spread them around Canada, do anything you want. If we have to close the church down, I won't grumble, I won't complain, and I won't try to explain it either. And I think that was a big forward step in my own experience.
What about what you were doing in your office, concerned about your people paying your salary and not doing the work of a pastor?
Well, I thought if they ever find out how much time I spend praying. See, I used to walk to my church. I lived a mile. The parsonage was a mile from the church, and I'd walk there in the morning. I tried to get there by 7 o'clock. Some mornings I was there, I guess, by 6 or even earlier. And I would just pray. And some mornings I prayed from 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock till 12 o'clock. And I thought, if these people ever find out how little time I'm spending doing the regular work of the pastor and how much time I'm praying, they'll likely fire me. I'm not sure they would have, but they might have. But I had such a burden to pray, I couldn't help it. I had to pray. And I'm sure it was just a sovereign work of God in my own heart, because I'm no different or any better than anybody else.
I would just like to begin by saying and making it very clear that I don't stand here as some peculiar authority on the subject of revival. And I'm sure Bill agrees in his own perspective. And I don't have all the answers. Someone has said the person who has all the answers probably hasn't even heard the question yet. And it's true. And we look at the ministry as such a growing process that we are never in a crusade whereby we are not learning ourselves and are gaining from being with God's people in every respect. But I guess the bottom line would be we just have to thank God for the privilege He allowed us to be in town when He saw fit to be in town to do a work at a very deep level. Now, I know pastors will say, well, God is in town all the time, and you make it sound as if He came just because you got there. But you understand the difference. The fact that we had the privilege of just being there right when God in His sovereignty saw fit to just open up the windows of heaven, that gave us that opportunity of being there. Let me give you a little frame of reference. Lou and I had been in evangelistic ministry for approximately 18 years, going from church to church across the United States and Canada. In fact, we had been in Canada in the year 1956. And it's interesting how God uniquely prepared us for what He was going to do in 1970-71, because in all of these years, from 1956 until now, there have only been 4 years that we have not ministered somewhere in Canada. Many of our American friends say, how is it you keep going to Canada for ministry? And my question is, how is it you don't go to Canada for ministry? It's almost as if God uniquely, in His sovereignty, saw fit to prepare us for that ministry. And there are many ways in which I could share that. But as evangelists, we would go to churches, and we would have the thrill of seeing a number of people find Christ as Savior. We would visit from door to door with the pastor or also with some of the people in the congregation. I would take some with me. Lou would take some with him. We would lecture on soul winning and would share in seeing people saved, and it was delightful to see that. But to go back to some of those places a year or two later and say, where are those people that we prayed with while we were here? Only to find that not much could be found in that area. Little did we know at that time what we understand now, that the condition of the evangelical church in our country and across North America is such that I am convinced that most newborn believers first must backslide in order to feel at home with the rest of the Christians in our churches. And we became very frustrated with not seeing long-range effects in the lives of people and also in congregations. And it was as if God began to burden our hearts to be concerned about the people of the church, the believers, to be thoroughly right with God. And so God began to move us away from merely preaching evangelistic sermons into starting out 3 or 4 or 5 nights with ministering to the believers about full surrender to the Lordship of Christ. But the problem was that if you're there for an evangelistic crusade for 8 days, and if you spent 3, 4, or 5 nights preaching to the Christians, you must then turn to the unsaved, because after all, this is an evangelistic crusade. And we would turn to the unsaved before the believers were really touched at a deep level. And we saw the futility of halfway getting believers into a right relationship with God, and then turning toward the unsaved, and then leaving, especially after 8 days, because, you know, at that time we had our schedule full. We had to be off to the next crusade, as most evangelists try to do. And people saying, can't you stay a little longer? I'm sorry, we're too busy. Doesn't that sound exciting? To me, it sounds now very abortive to the work of God when God was about to break through. And God began to show us the tragedy of moving in that direction. And soon people began to say to us, do you know what you're preaching? You're preaching a message of the Lordship of Christ. Lordship of Christ. Lordship of Christ. What happened? Well, in our ministry, I would do most of the evangelistic preaching. Lou would preach 3 or 4 nights to Christians. I would do most of the evangelistic preaching. He would do some, but we would mix it some. But primarily, that's the way it went. When God began to turn our philosophy of ministry around to say, all right, now we're just going to believe God to keep on ministering to believers as long as we're there. So we scheduled the meetings for 10 days and then 2 weeks. So we're just going to keep on preaching that way until God breaks through. What happened was, God in a unique way showed us the blessing of getting people together in homes after the services at night. They would be like afterglow fellowships. And we would start in 11 o'clock at night, and sometimes 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. We were still there, ministering to people, sharing burdens, praying with people. And then go home, and then I'd get up and have an 10 o'clock morning Bible study, and Lou would be sleeping. That is, he'd get caught up on the sleep to be prepared for the night, and I was there in the morning, and then ministering to people through the early afternoon, go home for a few hours, get ready for the evening service, and go through that cycle, night after night, day after day. You know why? Because we had to win the world to Christ all ourselves, round the clock. And it was there that God began to work in my life very specifically, where he literally laid me low to the place that I came to physical exhaustion, where I could not go any longer. I had no voice. I lost my voice completely. No energy to produce a voice. It wasn't a mental, emotional breakdown. It was merely physical exhaustion. Now, that was a tragedy. Just to think, now my brother had to do all the preaching. Just think what those congregations had to listen to. And in that process is where I had to come to the place, personally, to this whole principle of being crucified with Christ in a very practical way about my ministry, where I had to say, Lord, I'm willing, if I never preach another sermon again. I'm willing to just go and make a few announcements. In fact, Lou would be preaching. I would be in bed all day because of trying to gain some strength. Get up out of bed, make a few announcements, go home. That's all the energy I had. I said, Lord, I'm willing, if that's what it takes, to lay it all down, never to preach again. Surrender the rights to the ministry completely. Now, you may not be able to completely relate to that except to say, and for the record's sake, that I love to preach. In fact, in studying for the ministry, when we were in a ministerial sermon contest where we went to university, out of 1,100 students who were in the ministerial class, I found myself as one of the 3 finalists to preach for commencement. So I love to preach. And therefore, for me to have to be flat on my back and say, Lord, it's no more mine, it's thine, was not easy. But that's where it had to come. And it was at that point, when God began to restore my strength, just a little at a time, I recognized that we could no longer do our 45-minute musical performance that we would do every night and then go into preaching and then have all the rest of the ministry. That God began to lead me into sharing with congregations in worship. No more musical program primarily, no more readings primarily, no more duets primarily, no voice for that, but just leading a chorus or two and letting the congregation enter in. Little did I recognize then, in the 1970, that was all a part of the preparation of God honing my brother in to do more preaching, of God preparing me to be able to lead the meetings and lead congregations in worship. That God was preparing us for Western Canada, in Prince George, British Columbia. I'll never forget the pastor sitting on the platform. In fact, before getting to the platform, he said to me, he said, Ralph, during this crusade, don't ask me about anything. My job is to pray. God has given me a burden of prayer. He would sit on the platform, his head down, very morbid as it were. Just pray. He said, you ask the associate for anything you need to know. A week and a half like that. He would just sit there, would never say a word, but he was praying. A week and a half later, when God began to work at that church, one night that man was all excited, and he was a free man. And he turns to the congregation, and he says to the congregation, folks, I want you to know that tonight God has released me. From what? For 1 solid year, I have hardly slept a night. God laid a burden of revival for my church, for this community, for the province of British Columbia on my heart. And last night, God said to me, all right, my child, I've heard your prayer. Now go to sleep. And he was like a bird let out of the cage for the rest of the time. Little does the world know that that man, Brother Cliff Dietrich, was one of the human instruments who came to Brother Bill McLeod's church in the first week of the crusade at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Saskatoon to minister to a group of pastors who were coming for a pastor's day. And God used that little mighty might, if I can say it this way, to stimulate the hearts of pastors and all of us together at those early days. And so we started in with about 190 people on the first night, scheduled for 10 days. Where does revival begin? Well, there's so much we could say, and Brother Bill, I believe it would only be right for us to remind people of what God said to Duncan Campbell.
We had Duncan Campbell in our church in 1969. He was in the city for a week. He was in our church for maybe 2 or 3 days. And he didn't say anything to any of us in Saskatoon, but my brother Keith, who was an evangelist living in Kenora, Ontario, had brought him over for a month of meetings in Western Canada. And he told my brother, after being with us in Saskatoon, that one night while he was in prayer, God had showed him that he was going to send a revival to Canada that would begin in the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Saskatoon. My brother didn't tell me either, and I'm glad they didn't tell me, because I might have been trying then to make it happen. And he shared this publicly in at least 2 other places, the Interlake Country in Manitoba. Some pastors told me after the revival, he'd been there before the revival and told them revival was coming starting in Saskatoon and so on. And by the way, in relation to that, some Gideons from Canada were in India, and one of them mentioned in a public meeting about the revival in Saskatoon, Canada, and he saw a corner of the meeting just light up. And after some men came up, they were very excited, and they said, "Did you say there was a revival in Saskatoon, Canada?" He said, "Yes, why?" They said, "For 3 years we've been praying for revival in Saskatoon, Canada. We don't even know how we got the name." So God was working. Maybe this was true in other countries as well. We really don't know.
So revival is when hidden springs really spring forth. Where does it really begin? Could it have begun in the heart of that elderly couple in Vernon, British Columbia? 4 years earlier, Lou and I had had the privilege of being in their church for an evangelistic crusade. And it was at that time God laid it on the heart of that lady. As she prayed, she said, "Lord, those twins have a good ministry. But Lord, somehow I believe you want to give them a revival ministry to the church." And for 4 solid years, that woman and her husband prayed every single day that God would touch this ministry and give it a revival orientation to the church. It's interesting, that elderly couple way up in their 70s at that time, interesting that up in their 80s, when I was getting on the plane in Toronto one day to go to one of our major conferences in Winnipeg, Manitoba, here I look on the plane, and there's that elderly couple, now well up in their 80s, and they're sitting on the plane, and I looked, and I was so surprised. I didn't know they were in Eastern Canada. And I noticed that they were kind of all bundled up and towels around their necks, as it were. And I went back and said, why, where are you going? Why, he said, they said, "We're going to Winnipeg to the Canadian Revival Fellowship Conference." I said, "Why are you doing? Look, you're not well." And they were coughing, and they were sick. They were quite ill. I said, "How is it you could come so ill?" He said, "Shh, we didn't call our doctor this morning. We were afraid he would not let us go." There they were in their 80s. Now that woman is in her 90s in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Heart for revival, and she saw it all happen. Answer to her prayers. Where does revival begin? It's when hidden springs spring forth that we know nothing about. And so it started. 190 people in the Ebenezer Baptist Church. I'll never forget the first person who responded, the first or the second night of the meetings. It was one of those ladies in the church who was so concerned about revival for Canada, concerned about the political affairs, the moral situation in the country, and all kinds of situations, you know, the kind of people that are concerned that an evangelistic, an awakening takes place before revival in the church, concerned about the nation. And God said to her, "Irma, why are you praying for revival in Canada when you have some things that need to be made right with your pastor's wife? Don't talk about praying for revival in Canada when you've got to make some things right. Your pastor's wife." Is that right, Bill?
That's right.
That's your wife, wasn't it?
Mhm.
And that's what happened.
That's what happened, yes.
That was the beginning, the first lady to respond. God showed her how personal revival was. Not concerned about way out there, but in here. And during that time, her husband had a brother. Tell us that story.
There were 2 boys in the family. Actually, there were 4 brothers, but these 2 brothers did not get along. They fought all the time. I didn't know when I got there that they used to sing duets together. They hadn't sung together for 11 years. They hadn't spoken together for 2 years. One was the choir director, the other was the chairman of the music committee, so they operated by hand signals through third parties. But the oldest of the 2, they were both in their 40s, both Bible school graduates, and the oldest of the 2 one night met God in revival, and so we got a hold of him the next day, I guess it was, and suggested to him that he and his brother get together and we try and get this thing straightened out. He said God had been telling him that too. So his brother had been very critical. I remember I hated to see him coming towards me because he always had some grief to unload on me. His children were all straying from God. He was blaming that on me, blaming it on the church. We never had a program to reach his kids and so on. And I just hated to see him coming. Anyway, we talked to him, and he kind of grunted approval. And we went down in the lower auditorium, the chairman of the deacons board, myself, and these 2 brothers. The church upstairs was praying because they all knew about the problem by this time. Sam went over to the other boy who was seated and put out his hand and said, "My brother, can you forgive me?" And Arnie went like this. It's about time you came. And Sam said to me, I knew he wouldn't forgive me, and he started for the door, and I just prayed and said, God, don't let him get through the door. And he got to the door and stood with his back to us. And I turned on this other brother, and I just poured a truckload of Bible verses on him. And it didn't do anything. So I turned to Ken and said, Ken, let's pray for God to speak to him. And so we did. And while we were praying, God broke him. He gave a scream, and he ran to the wall. It was a cement block wall. And he was beating his fists on the wall and kicking the wall with his feet and begging God to have mercy on his soul. He ran around us for a while, crying to God to have mercy on him. And he began pouring out all kinds of junk that had been bottled up inside for years. He'd been disciplined on a very serious charge by the Alliance Church in the same city years before. He'd never made it right. And our church, before I was pastor, took him in as a member because he had 3 brothers there, no questions asked. He got the whole thing straightened out between him and God. I looked at him. He was just smiling from ear to ear, and I pointed to his brother Sam, and he ran to his brother and threw his arms around him, and they cried and hugged a while and came upstairs. When they came upstairs, the whole congregation got to their feet, and they marched down to the front. Their wives came, their children came, because the wives and kids have been fighting too, and they all knelt at the front of the church, these 2 families. And the church just sat there crying and praying and watching this miracle at the front of the church. And of course, this gave a tremendous push to things. We moved in the meantime to the Alliance Church. Well, we moved to the Anglican Church, then the Alliance Church. And they were to sing a duet one night, but of course, Arnie could not sing that duet until he made things right with the Alliance Church. So from the pulpit, he asked the church to forgive him, and they did. And suddenly one of the Alliance members got to his feet and made a motion that they accept Arnie back in as a member of their church. Somebody seconded the motion, and they took a vote on it, so he was a member of 2 churches at one time. So. Nobody seemed to care. It was just a beautiful spirit flowing between the churches. I should mention this because this, I think, had something to do with it. God taught me before the revival, if people wander into your congregation from another gospel-preaching church, phone the pastor and tell him about it. So I used to phone pastors and say, a couple of your sheep wandered over into my corral, you better check them out. So when my sheep wandered into their corral, they phoned me. And this created a beautiful spirit between the churches so that when the revival broke, pastors were not afraid to tell their people, get in on the blessing, because they knew I wasn't going to try and, steal their people.
Of course, there was one pastor who said that because we were coming and we had been in his church several times and we were known in the community. In fact, it was the community where I met my wife. And he said that he purposely programmed his church, over-programmed them with special events to keep his people from coming to the Baptist church during those meetings. And his people would come to him and say, Pastor, do you know that a revival is going on over there in the Baptist church? And he said he just boiled inside because here he had programmed to keep them away. And Pastor, did you know that a revival is going on? A revival is going on. And it got to the place that we had to move from the Ebenezer Baptist Church, that would seat about 300 people, move to the Anglican Church that would seat 700 people. We were there 2 nights, and it was filled. And it was at that time we get a phone call right during the meeting from the pastor of this church who said, look, if you have liberty, we are now ready to open the doors of our church for you to come. And that church would seat about 1,100 people. What was interesting was that they were getting ready for their missionary convention. And in that denomination, the missionary convention is almost like the sacred cow. And it was interesting that during that time, one of the missionaries who was to be at the convention was already there. And he found out that they were canceling their missionary convention so that they could all get in on this revival that was taking place. And it's interesting that that missionary resented the fact that he said, I'm packing up and going home. It's amazing how it happens. You talk about a sense of humor. That missionary who was supposed to be there is now a member of the Canadian Revival Fellowship. And so then from there that weekend, we filled the church and moved to the 3rd Avenue United Church that would seat 1,700 people. And during the whole period of time of about 7.5 weeks, that United Church was filled night after night.
Double services.
Double services on Sundays. In the middle of the winter, people would come early for a seat. About 25% of the congregation would be young people under 25 years of age sitting on the edge of their seats, as it were. They were driving miles from all over. To see what? See two little twins. To see a song leader, 83 years of age, Dr. Virgil Brock, who could not hold a tune because his voice was so old, standing up there leading the singing instead of all the modern techniques. Everything was backwards. Interesting the way it all happened. And yet, what were they seeing? You talk about the presence of God. There were some nights where all we would do is sing one song and give an invitation. And people would pour out of the aisles to meet God. They could not stand it any longer. One night, we say, all right, now who wants to share? And here's a young lady, a 16-year-old teenager, comes walking down the aisle. And she had one of those granny gown outfits on, and she comes walking down the aisle. You don't know what to expect and say, who wants to share? She walks up on the platform and she says, I would like to sing my testimony. And she starts to sing in front of that crowd. Guess what? From a teenager. Oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure as thou art. Come in thy sweetness. Come in thy fullness. Stamp thine own image deep on my heart. And we just watched the congregation melt. Tears streaming down the faces of people all over that congregation. And we knew, what do? You're in a meeting, right in the middle of a meeting, people weeping all over the place, and the sermon hasn't been preached yet. What do? We had no other room to use. We just stopped right in the middle of the meeting and said, all right, it's time for people to respond. And they came pouring down the rows and filled the front of the altar. And for 1/2 hour, we just stopped in that meeting and just let people quietly pray, and then they just started spontaneously sing in worship. Draw me near, as these people are responding to meet God. You see, we were in something that was totally out of our hands. And there were some days for 4 and 5 hours a day, we would get phone calls from all across North America saying, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? Tell us, is it a youth revival? No, we say there's no generation gap here. We're all getting together on the same bridge. When the 18-year-olds are loving to pray with the 80-year-olds, and the 80-year-olds are loving the teenagers, and it was just marvelous. And all at once, we pick up the newspaper and see where one Saturday, 12 churches had canceled their Sunday night service, and their advertisement said, we are joining the revival meetings. Spontaneously happening. I said to the pastor, I said, do we need to have some kind of an article in the paper as to what's happening? So he said, well, we try with this editor, but we don't get too far. I said, well, maybe we ought to take something down now that, look what's happening. We're in the 6th or 7th week, or a little sooner than that, actually. And so I go with the pastor down, and he says, we have an article to put in the paper about what's happening. And the editor says, oh, no. So you don't need that. Look at here. I've already written an article. And the pastor almost had a heart attack. I've already written. And the article was titled, front headlines, paper, Renewed Morality in the Wake of Revival. What had happened? So many people were making restitution around town, stolen goods. The department stores were calling up the newspaper to say, what's going on in town? The police were reporting that nighttime crime was at an all-time low during those days. People were calling the radio station saying, you better get this on the radio, this is of interest, and get it on television. It's interesting. We were called to go on television and share what was happening, and after we got finished, or actually even during the interview, the interviewer said when he heard what was happening to God's people, making things right with each other, and pastors making things right with each other, one full day from about 8 in the morning till 5 o'clock in the evening, all day, pastors and wives making things right with each other in the community. Then the reporter says, it's about time something like that happened to the church. It's amazing how much the world knows on the outside of what we need. And then we get off the television, and he calls the radio station. Hey, you should have these fellows on. Now, you know it's a revival when a television reporter will suggest you go on the radio. And all around town, the word began to spread. People began to come from every direction. What were some of the results, Bill?
Oh, 500-page book. The Western Tract Mission has headquarters in Saskatoon. They have about 3,000 tract distributors in Canada. They reported the first 12 months after the revival that tract sales and distributions had about tripled. That was one thing. The Alliance denomination reported that in Western Canada, their churches, in the 12 months after the revival, that there was a 100% increase in souls won to Christ in the 12 months following the awakening.
Let me just allude to one thing right there.
Okay.
That superintendent of that denomination, 2.5 years later, came to us as we had supper together, and he said, "Twins, you'll be interested to know that as superintendent of 70 churches, I have not been called out on one troubleshooting assignment in any one of those churches in 2.5 years." I said, "You mean to tell me that those churches have not had any problems in 2.5 years?" "No," he said, "I didn't say that." He said, "I, as superintendent, have not been called out to solve their problems." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Because," I love this, he said, "because the revival taught church leaders how to find the solution to their problems on their knees with knee pads instead of with boxing gloves." A direct result of that denomination. Go ahead, Bill.
The denomination I was with, for the first time in their history, went over the top in their financial budget. They'd never done this before. So it had an effect in those areas. Changed lives by the thousands. Chaplain of the Baptist Seminary in Toronto heard about this, was asked to do some articles for some Eastern Canadian Christian publications, so he flew down to Saskatoon. I met him. I'd met him before, actually, and he said, "Now, don't be disappointed that I won't get involved." He said, "I'm here just to pick up some information and do an article or two for these Eastern publications." Well, we just smiled. Everybody was getting involved. And one night, he and I were standing at the front of the church, over at the wall here. The place was packed from wall to wall, from the front to the first pews. And he said to me, this chaplain, he said, "I know how to lead a soul to Christ. I wouldn't have a clue how to help any of those people there." And just as he said it, a man came up and took him by the arm and said, "Sir, could you pray with me, please?" And I just took off and left him. Well, he got revived. And here's what happened. He went back to the seminary, and the next morning he was walking across the campus, and he passed a male student, and all he said was, "Good morning." I heard the student's testimony. He told us, he said, "I saw Jesus Christ in the chaplain's face." He fled in terror back to his room and fell on his knees and prayed for 2 solid hours. So the chaplain got an SOS to us, could we come down with a team? So we got a motley crew together. Let's see, the Alliance pastor's son, cowboy boots and all, 17 years of age, who's now a pastor, by the way, and 2 Baptist pastors. The rest were lay people from the Alliance church, so 5 or 6 of us, and somebody, a revived businessman, paid the bill to fly us, 1,200 miles from Winnipeg, or from Saskatoon, it's further than that, 1,700 miles to Toronto. It was the longest meeting I was ever in. Our team shared, I don't suppose I spoke more than 8 or 10 minutes, and then we sat down and waited for something to happen. It just exploded. The meeting went on for 14 hours, with people coming, kneeling one by one at a chair at the front, asking our team to counsel with them and pray with them. And a professor was sitting there, and suddenly he got to his feet with a loud and bitter cry. He started down the aisle. The tears were literally spurting from his eyes. He fell across this chair, and I will never forget his prayer. He said, "Oh, my God, all these years I've sought and taught the academic, but now I want the spiritual."
Amen.
I was in India ministering to the Martoma Church in southern India, which church traditionally apparently was started by the Apostle Thomas, and there's historical evidence that it was. There were several thousand people at this annual conference. There was a team missionary there. I shared first. He was on next, and he shared this with the crowd. He said, a team came from that seminary in Toronto after the revival meetings there to my home church. I was a backslidden missionary. I had no intention of ever coming back to India. I'm back in India because of what God did in my heart from the revival in Canada.
Well, if you start there,
Yeah.
we have problems, don't we? In Winnipeg alone, in the one crusade that God allowed Brother Bill to have with some of the other men, there are at least 30 people who are now in full-time Christian service from one crusade alone, who date their response to God as being the turning point in their hearts and lives. We keep a file of people who write us letters, and I could go on of the long range effects. In fact, on one mission station alone, there were 4 missionaries who were in one place together and without knowing each other found out that they were all there as a direct result of the Canadian revival. And it goes around the world. There's hardly a place in Canada where we can go without running into someone who has been directly affected or indirectly affected through what God has seen fit to do in a very real way. The Bible colleges of Western Canada, almost every one of them, has stated that they have had to go into an enlargement program because of the increased number of applications for coming to Bible college. And one of the registrars told me, said, you know, it's of interest to read the applications and to see we are here because of the change that took place in our parents' lives as a result of revival. Or I am here because I was saved in the midst of the revival. And it goes on, the long-range effects in people's hearts and lives.
A critic of the revival from the States was up in Canada ministering the Canadian Bible College in Regina, and I guess he was testing the waters, and he said, how many of you students, or several hundred students there, how many of you students could say that the Canadian revival had any influence on your life? And practically every hand in the place went up. And a friend of mine was there. I was not there at the time. He said the man stepped backward, his mouth flew open, then he made some remark to the effect that he'd have to revise his evaluation of the revival in Canada. Now, teams went out. We began getting SOSs. We ran out of preachers, so we just put some lay people together and sent them as a team to a church, and revival was spurting here and there. Every province in Canada was visited. Every state in the Union, including Alaska, was visited. Teams went to Vietnam, to Thailand, to Belgium and Holland and the British Isles, and I don't know, India, I don't know where else, the Philippines, just spreading out from the revival center. There's a certain historian, he studied revival for many, many years and written many books on the subject of revival, and he publicly criticized in Minneapolis at a pastor's conference. Someone asked him why he had never referred to Canadian revival, because he'd been talking about the Hebrides Awakening and all these other revivals, and he said because it was not a genuine revival. So they asked him why he had this evaluation, and he said because it never moved out of Saskatoon. Well, he never knew that we stopped counting, about 16 years ago, we stopped counting teams going out when it came to 2,000. One team we know of, one church rather, sent out 700 teams, one church alone. He didn't know a thing about this. He later on apologized publicly for having made this kind of evaluation without having all the facts. So God spread it around Canada, the States, to many foreign countries. Should say this perhaps before I turn it back to Ralph again. In Winnipeg, there was a group, out of the revival meetings that we had, we spilled over, went for 5 weeks there, and had to move to we started in a church seating 1,200, had to move to a larger building and so on, double service, all this kind of thing. And a group of German-speaking people, Pentecostal, Baptist, and Mennonites. There are many Mennonites in Winnipeg. They got together and ran a crusade of their own, a revival crusade for 3 solid weeks, and out of that, a team of 65 or 70 German-speaking people went to Germany and all over the country spreading the truths of revival, what God was doing back in Canada. So God spread it around in a remarkable way.
People say, what does revival have to do with evangelism? Well, I've already alluded to it. Think of all those people in full-time service now around the world who are sharing the truths of the gospel and the truths of walking in the Spirit with God at such a very deep level. I think it would be of interest to our viewers and to all of us here to just what are the end results of all of this as far as the Canadian Revival Fellowship? What do you see happening today? And by the way, that 7.5 weeks in Saskatoon ended on Grey Cup Sunday in November, which is Super Bowl Sunday in the United States, with 4,000 people in the large city auditorium in the middle of the winter, when they would expect nobody would show up on such a day. And yet God was so at work at such a deep level, and it was so thrilling and exciting to see it happen. What are some of the long-range effects?
Somebody in Canada once said, if you've ever been in a revival of this kind, or she used the term revival fire of this kind, even if you happen to get cold, you'll have the smell of smoke on your clothes till you die. And you know, there's a lot of truth in that. There are people who were mightily revived that are perhaps cool now, but when you talk to them, they'll weep, and sometimes they'll come back again. One of the professors from Dallas Theological Seminary was in Winnipeg years after the revival, I think maybe 5, 6 years, and he inquired, he met with the evangelical pastors of the city, and he asked them this question: what did the Canadian revival do for the churches in Winnipeg? He was so pleased at the reply he got that he phoned me long distance. I happened to be home. He said, I thought you'd like to know this. They told me it had a profound effect on the churches in Winnipeg insofar as sparking evangelism was concerned. I was glad, very, very glad to hear that.
You know, people will say, well, what's going on now as far as, does Western Canada need another revival? And before you try to answer that, remember, it was not only spread to Europe and other places, but in the United States. Lou and I went home from that Western Canadian situation where we spent up there until December 22nd. We started in October, and we're there for the rest of the year. Went home and shared on 2 Sunday nights in our home congregation what was taking place, and a revival broke out in Mansfield, Ohio, in our home church. Our congregation, our people, as a result of that, have sent out lay teams to hundreds of churches in eastern United States. But it's interesting that the Decision magazine sent a group of reporters to do a write-up about leading churches in America. And it just happened to be that those men were in our congregation the very next week after Lou and I had the privilege of sharing with the congregation what happened in Western Canada. And on the next Sunday, the people of our congregation spent 10 hours in church. A spontaneous revival broke out. And here these reporters are from Decision magazine trying to tell this story. And they report what they saw happening till 1 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday night. It was happening. Interesting. One of those men said that if this kind of experience had been mine earlier in my life, I would not have received a phone call from Europe just this week while I'm here about a breakup of a marriage of my own son and daughter-in-law if I, as a father, had been living this kind of a lifestyle. It's interesting that Dr. Sherwood Wirt from Decision magazine flew to Western Canada. Do you know why? Because Leonard Ravenhill told him. Tell him about that.
Leonard Ravenhill phoned him. He calls him Woody, Sherwood Wirt. So he said, Woody, there's revival in Canada. Hop a plane, fly to Canada. Revival is next door to heaven. Those were the exact words. So he phoned me. I don't know where he got my name from, maybe from Mr. Ravenhill, and asked where the revival was. Well, I said closest to Minneapolis, where he lived, was Winnipeg. We're in the height of the revival there. So he told us he'd be there for one night only, and I saw him. He was sitting about 3 pews back from the front. And that particular night, people began coming forward before we gave an invitation, and we filled the whole front of the church, seating 1,200. Then we filled the platform and filled the choir loft. Then we started emptying front pews. We emptied the first front pew and the second, and then the third got to him, and he had to move. And so he came up to stand beside me at the front, and he told me this. He said, you know, I've been working with Billy for 25 years. I've seen evangelism in the largest scale, of course, in 25 years, but I've never, ever seen revival. And he said, this is revival. I cannot explain what I'm seeing in any other way. And then he told me, he said, our organization, not Billy, Billy's clean, he's on top, but the organization desperately needs revival. And finally he said, and I need revival. He'd heard the testimony of a late couple, Harry Neville and Thiessen, who, by the way, he was a civil engineer, and they're now one of our full-time teams. He took early retirement from his work. They're all over the country conducting revival crusades, weekend meetings, and all the rest of it. And they had given their testimony there night, and their testimony was this. She was going to leave him and take the girls and move to Vancouver and leave them with the boys in Winnipeg. They couldn't communicate. If one of the kids spilled milk on the table, he'd be mad for 2 weeks. He wouldn't say a word. He was a perfectionist, you see. And he heard their testimony that night, and that spoke to him, so he invited them to come back to Minneapolis, which they did, and they conducted an afterglow there, and in that afterglow, Sherwood Wirt met God. Then he began traveling all over the country. He phoned Billy Graham and said, Billy, I've experienced revival. And Billy said, great, bring it down here. You know, he said, Billy didn't understand. But after some of those great crusades, Sherwood Wirt used to gather hundreds of people in behind the grandstands or wherever he could and have a little afterglow there. And finally, his wife met God in revival. He phoned me one night. It was in meetings in Beulah Alliance in Edmonton. And he said, my wife met God. Our home is like heaven. Thank God.
Actually, you know, Bill is saying that. But he's not speaking out of school, because Sherwood Wirt has written the book called Afterglow, where he tells this whole story for the world to read. And on one of the first pages he said, here I was working for the biggest evangelist in the world, but no one was working for me. And then he talks about a bearded engineer from Winnipeg who tells me to get down in a chair, and he says, Sherwood, you have to die. And he said, no, I didn't even know if that was theologically correct. And he tells the story. It's a blow-by-blow account, how God absolutely transformed his life and his ministry as a result of it all. We could go on and on. Our time is up, even though I don't like that idea. But just to say this, that it has been a ministry of lay people who have caught the flame. And now there are a handful of lay teams that are involved in full-time ministry who sat in the pews, and God laid his hand on them. They minister with some of us, and they minister on their own. And also now the thrill, an internship program is established, where we're now working with 10 or 11 interns, that is, those who have a heart for revival. Now they work with us in crusades, with Brother Bill with crusades, and with other people who are being trained now, long-range effects, as a direct result of what it is God is doing. And when all is done and all is said, let me remind you, there's no such thing as a perfect revival. You know why? There's no such thing as perfect revivalists. Isn't that right, Bill?
That's right. That's the problem.
You see, as long as my brother's doing a lot of the preaching, there'll never be a perfect crusade. And as long as his brother says the same thing, there'll never be a perfect crusade. And there has been some fallout in certain areas where the follow-through has not been what it ought to have been. But God has taught us all, and we've all grown, and we've all learned. And I'm more excited now about what God can do and what he is doing than ever before. You say, do you believe that God can still revive hearts and lives and homes and transform marriages and put people together and restitution made to the place that even the government officials get letters about things that need to be made right, paying income taxes and all the rest of it, sending back diplomas, master's degrees being turned back because they cheated on final examination, on and on we can go. All a direct result of way back there were some hungry hearts. Just think, it started with a pastor who got sick and tired of playing the games. Hidden springs of people who were praying, hungry. The world didn't know anything about it. And so where could it be for those of you who are here and those who may view what I'm saying? Revival. It's personal. It starts where the fame of revival can become a flame for revival, or it can spark. And I would trust that as a result of even our discussion, that God will use it to inspire within your heart a whole new degree of faith to believe God for the supernatural. Those things that we've given up on. But thank God, he's in full control and nothing's out of order as far as he's concerned. Amen? Amen.